Our political panel for the day, can't wait to ask them about job share, but we'll come to that. From Darwin, Labor MP Luke Gosling is with us. Welcome, Luke. And from Melbourne, Liberal MP Aaron Violi. Welcome back to you too, Aaron. Why don't we start with social media? And, this is obviously flowing on from events in Sydney last week. Luke, to you first of all. They're talking about an upgraded set of laws and penalties. Is it clear to you that if this was applied to a company like X, it would make it more socially responsible about the content on that platform?
We really need to have a system that has more accountability as a part of it, and that's because it's our job as governments to protect our citizens. And quite frankly, at the moment, if you've got some operators of digital platforms that think they're above Australian law, then we need laws to have an ability to hold them to a higher standard.
Do you see Aaron Violi X? I don't want to keep coming back to them. They are but one social media platform, but they're the one that seem to be causing the most trouble here by being unresponsive. Do you see a scenario in which they can no longer operate legally in Australia?
Well, I think it will depend. That's quite a big leap that we're going to, Greg, but they do have a responsibility, as Luke said, to work with governments and have a social licence. And I think it's important we also understand the context of what was asked of X last week wasn't to curb free speech, and I, as much as anyone, will defend free speech. I think it's a fundamental part of our democracy. They weren't asked to curb free speech. People were able to comment on what had happened, but they were asked to remove a video that was quite graphic, and they have a responsibility as a publisher to do that. The ABC media publishers have a responsibility. As an example, certain movies can't be shown at certain times based on the ratings. So this isn't unprecedented to ask a media organisation to adhere to regulations and requirements. We've got to be very careful with any proposed laws to make sure that we're not curbing free speech, and that's a fundamental part of who we are. But in this case, being asked to take down that video, I think was a legitimate request and should have been adhered to.
Now, it does sound, Luke, like there's a degree of bipartisanship. We don't quite know where it's going to take us, but to at least explore better regulation in this area. Is it clear to you whether that extends through to the other body of work that Michelle Rowland has on her plate at the moment, and that is misinformation? Is that the way by which incidents like last week are best controlled, or is it by strengthening the existing tools?
Yeah, well, obviously we're keen to enter into the Parliament some new laws this year. There's been great consultation with stakeholders so far. Elon Musk and this sideshow aside, and he does need to pull his head in, but when it comes to the good consultation we've had so far, it's all shaping up pretty well. And as Aaron said, we don't want to curb free speech in any way, and indeed it's not seen that ACMA will be able to order the taking down of a specific post. But if we find that there are players in the industry that aren't abiding by a code of conduct or aren't abiding by the standards that we expect in our community, when I'm a father of young kids, I don't want my kids exposed to that, and I think most Australians are pretty common sense about this. We need a framework, legislation in which we can hold these digital platforms to a higher standard, and I think Australians will support that. I hope the opposition support that. They've been a bit off the idea in the past, but it's good to see some positive comment from the opposition about this.
I'm sure there is a degree of public support for examining this, and we did have David Coleman on earlier, Aaron, sort of saying, we're open to talking to the government. But I observed to him, and I'll ask to you, you do start from a long way apart, don't you? Your position on misinformation, you're going to have to, or someone's going to have to, shift a lot of ground here.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of work to be done, and it's separate issues, and we've got to make sure we don't conflate them. One of our biggest criticisms of the misinformation and disinformation bill is, I know Luke's saying that ACMA doesn't decide what it is. Well, they kind of have to, because they set the fines, and it's very technical. But as this bill was being debated, as an example, at the same time the IR bill was being debated in the House, and Tony Burke, the minister, Quite often in question time, and often the questions were worded this way, they specifically referenced misinformation and disinformation about the IR bill. So the scenario we need to avoid is a government deciding that criticism of their policy is misinformation and disinformation, and then that being taken down by social media. I don't think that's a world that anyone wants to get to. So we need to make sure that, you know, political free speech is protected, but finding ways to protect young children, as Luke said, young people from the harms of social media. I mean, another thing that I think should be part of the discussion, and to be really clear, this is my opinion, not coalition policy, but I think there's a discussion to be had around, should you be forced to put your identity, you know, your name, your face, be verified on social media, your age as well, to make sure that you're meeting the age requirements? Because if we have a bit of sunlight on social media, it's a separate issue, but it's linked, suddenly we might not see some of the vitriol and some of the bots and those kind of things being used. So I think that's a conversation I personally believe we should be having, but there's a bit of a gap, as you said, between where the coalition are, where the government is, but I think there's good faith on both sides to find a way forward.
Yeah, just on that, Luke, the suggestion Aaron makes, that would have some potential, wouldn't it, to filter out some of the more anonymous or fictitious trolls who don't have the courage of their convictions to use their own name and identity.
Yeah, and as Aaron would know, as members of Parliament, we get a fair bit of attention by them, people who don't want to put their name to things and feel pretty brave being anonymous. And look, some people might have their reasons for doing that because of their workplace or what have you. But at the end of the day, we need some common sense reforms here, because misinformation and disinformation is used by malign actors. And I think what we've seen in the last week or so is our fantastic security agencies just flagging the fact that this is a real problem. I am a member of the Security and Intelligence Committee, and I know through the briefings that we receive, and certainly what we've seen overseas, is that different non-state and state actors deliberately use disinformation in order to manipulate populations of people to reach a political outcome, and it's used by criminals across the board. Now, if people like Elon Musk don't want to work with governments such as ours, democracies such as ours, to not only defend democracy, but to make these platforms safer for our citizens, well then that's something he's going to have to deal with, and I look forward to receiving opposition support for common sense measures that really gets a handle on this, because without it, you know, it is a threat to democracy.
It's certainly pervasive, and I think there was an element of that misinformation around the preceding event, or the tragedy really, at Bondi Junction. But look, let's move on. I might park a conversation about GST carve-ups, because I'm really interested in the proposal around job sharing. Aaron, would you fancy your chances against an opponent where the opponent was 2 or 3 really energetic people?
Oh, I mean, it raises some interesting questions. I caught some of Anne Twomey's comments before about the constitutional issues, which I think are there. And, I mean, let's be honest and frank, being a member of Parliament, it's not a job. It's bigger than that. We all do it because we love what we do. I'm very fortunate to be a third-generation local, connected to my community, spent my whole life in the area and passionate about that. And it's not a job where you switch on and switch off. It is, in many ways, a 24 hours, 7 days a week job. We don't complain about that. We love it. We love our communities. And there's so many issues around voting and those kind of things. I don't think it's practical. Call me a cynic, but there's been quite a lot of media commentary about this in the last 24 hours. I wouldn't be surprised if one of the two that are talking about job sharing decide to pull out, and the others built quite a profile from free media. That might be the cynic in me, Greg, but politics and being a member of Parliament isn't a normal job. So I think the passion we have for our community means that we're always available, we're always on, and the idea that two people can be completely aligned on everything doesn't really make sense because there are so many conscious issues and so many decisions we have to make. So I think it's a role for one person.
OK, we don't encourage cynicism on afternoon briefing, but if you happen to get it right, Aaron Violi, you heard it here first. Luke Gosling, if you could imagine that this was legally possible, permitted through legislative change or even maybe a referendum, would you do it?
Nah, there's no way. It's such a responsibility. But you've got to be accountable, Greg. I mean, what would they do? For a start, they would disagree within a week, I'm sure. This job, as Aaron said, is an absolute privilege, but you've got to be accountable. And I think you can't just sub in and sub out when things might be getting a bit tricky. You've got to turn up day after day. You've got to be available 24/7. But to the point the ladies have made about the demands of the job and whether job sharing is going to work. But we've got more women than men in our federal Labor government. And there's incredible women. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have to balance all sorts of pressures like any parent or like anyone. There's heaps of pressures in the work that we do. But we've been able to find a lot of people, including Michelle Anandaraja, who's incredible.
The member for Higgins, right, yeah.
The member for Higgins. So if I was in that election, I'd say, don't worry, you've got the best already. Just back Michelle in and you'll have the best possible 24/7 member you could possibly have.
All right, well, I'm sure you'll get your email of appreciation from Michelle. Just finally on the female representation in Parliament, Aaron, again, imagining that this were legally possible, it could help lift numbers and ease the burden, couldn't it? Because this is not an easy workplace for women, let's face it.
Oh, as I said before, Greg, it's not an easy workplace for any of us. I'm a parent of 2 children. We all face those same challenges. I mean, as Greg... As Luke said, obviously Michelle's there. The people of Higgins also have the great opportunity to vote for Katie Allen, the former member for Higgins, who was able to balance her family and her career as that former member has put her hand up to run again. So I think Luke makes a good point that while it's challenging, many people, whether you're male, female, whatever your life situation, you can balance it in some way. And at the end of the day, it is an absolute privilege to have this responsibility, and sometimes the sacrifices we make are tough, but they're worth it. So that's just the situation we are prepared to put ourselves in, to put our hands up to serve our community and serve the nation. All
right, well, they've at least generated a discussion among lawyers, constitutional and politicians, even 2 male ones. We're going to thank you for partaking in that, Aaron and Luke. We'll get you back again very soon.
Talk soon. See you, Luke.